Okay, so this is the fifth lecture. Yep, this is the fifth lecture on chapters 4, 5, and 6, and that is development in the first 3 years of life. Actually, this lecture begins, we're talking specifically about the beginning of chapter 6. So if you're following along in your textbook, we're on page 161. And for the next several slides, we're talking about emotions, actually. And so recall psychosocial includes our psychological development and our interpersonal and our social development. Well, part of that includes personality and emotions. Just as a sort of in preparation, so let's first talk about what we mean by personality. And personality is defined as stable patterns of behaviors and thoughts and emotions that are consistent across time and place. Our personality is, I was just listening to a great podcast, and he talks about how personality is about half of it is inherited from our genes. The other half of it comes from our environmental inputs. Part of our personality has to do with how we respond. It's actually called neuroticism, and neuroticism is defined as one's emotional reactiveness. Are you relatively stable in your emotions, or are you relatively, or are you emotional? Do you get excited easy? Do you have more positive emotional experiences, or more negative emotions? So this section talks about specifically one part of one part of our personality, and that is emotions. Emotional researchers, and this is a cross-cultural psychologist, anthropsychologist, he's an anthropologist and he's a psychologist. His name is Eckelman, and he's uncovered what he calls six universal emotions, and that could show up on a quiz, so know what those six universal emotions are. And what he found was, so what he did is he traveled around the world and he showed people all over the world in different groups these different facial expressions and asked them to identify how these people were feeling. And he concluded that these six states were identifiable all over the world. People could recognize the facial expressions. And what I like about this picture here is because this picture shows you what that emotion looks like on babies, that babies also express anger, disgust, fear, happiness, sadness, and surprise, right? Okay, so research, we know that babies start showing emotions quite early. There's different kinds of, they're crying. We talk about a hungry cry. Anybody who's been around babies or has their own babies learns to recognize the pitch. So the different pitch, the different frequency, or that's not the word, but not canter, but the different wavelengths, that's not the right word either, of a cry, and recognize the difference between hungry cries, tired cries, poopy cries, painful cries, right? And some of those distinctions. Babies can smile almost immediately, but there is a distinction between what's called a reflex smile, and that's just when their face moves in that particular direction, and a social smile. Social smiles, which are smiles that are thought to be stimulate, like in response to the environment, those don't appear until about 2 months. Your textbook also talks about an anticipatory smiling, and this one is when infants smile at an object and then gaze at an adult while continuing to smile. So a reflex smile would be something that just happens. A social smile is when I look at you, and an anticipation smile is I look at something and then I look at you and I continue to smile, right? So those are considered to be first signs of emotions, first signs of emotions in babies. But a lot of the more complex emotions don't show up until later stages of development, and that's because a child has to develop a sense of self-awareness and a cognitive concept called theory of mind. I was looking to see if theory of mind is discussed in your chapter, and I don't see it real quickly, but theory of mind is simply the awareness that I have a mind, and my thoughts are different than your thoughts. Up until a child is able to comprehend, and so this is thought to be like the root of empathy, right? that a child has to first understand that they are distinctive from you, and that you and I are not thinking the same thing and we're not seeing the same thing. In a later chapter, I'll talk about some of the experiments that measure or capture, reflect this ability to understand theory of mind. But the point is that emotions, especially emotions like embarrassment, or what are some of the more sophisticated ones? There it is right there: pride, guilt, shame, embarrassment, empathy. All of these things require a child's ability, first of all, to know that they're separate than you, to know that your perception, the way the view of the world for them is different than the view of the world for you. But they also, these self-evaluative emotions mean they have to understand what's acceptable and that they've messed up, right? So if a child, if a parent tries to use, say, shame on you, you shouldn't have done such and such, before a child understands that they've broken some social rules, it won't be effective. I mean, I'll discourage you from using shaming anyway, but that's another point, right? So a child has to have knowledge of the socially expected behaviors in order for them to feel shame or guilt or even pride. Like, how can they can't feel good about themselves that they did something special if they don't understand how it's special, right? And then self-conscious emotions are the same thing: empathy, embarrassment. They have to understand that somebody has a view of them that may be different from themselves, if that makes any sense. But part of our ability to emote, so in the intro, in the psych class, we would talk about the different regions of the brain, right? The brain develops from the back to the front, which I think I should have said in another lecture. In the back, you have your motor, you have your ability to walk and breathe and things like this. In the middle of your brain, you have your emotional center. And in the front of your brain, you have your frontal lobe, which helps control your behavior. But the frontal lobe is the last to develop. So that means that your emotional center, your center that's implicated in experiencing emotions, or is developed before the part of your brain is developed that helps you regulate how to control those emotions or how to think about them. So emotions are really three different pieces. You have your physiological reaction, right? Your heart rate goes up, goes down, your blood pressure goes up, goes down, your hands get sweaty. You have your intellectual or your cognitive understanding of what you're feeling, and then you have the behavioral aspect, right? So babies get these, or toddlers get these first two. The last one to develop is their understanding of how they're supposed to express their emotion. So they're sad, they're angry, they're just going to emote, they're just going to behave because they haven't figured out. And that's where parents come in, right? That's where people come in. And in sociology, we talk about how you're socialized into your emotions, but this is where adults teach children what's the appropriate expression. I understand you're feeling sad. Adults label that emotional experience. They label that physiology, that feeling that they're having. They label it sad. But you don't get to hit your brother. Now they're telling them how they're supposed to behave or how they're supposed to emote. But it requires a certain level of brain development in order for all of this to happen, right? And that's kind of what this is about right here, is that somewhere around 3 to 9 months, this frontal lobe begins to interact with the limbic system, and that's the emotional center. So that's when we begin to see some expressions of emotion that are a bit more sophisticated. There's a term right here, both of these right here: social cognition, empathetic or altruistic, and empathy. Right, so there's some evidence of empathy. There's a really cool video I'll try to find that shows kids. So empathy is your ability to feel what someone else is feeling. Altruistic, this is the one that develops a little bit later. Altruistic behavior is defined as a kind of behavior that I do and I don't expect any return. I just do something nice, I just help you, but I don't expect to get anything in return. That's the one that the video, and that seems to show up at about 1.5 years. Social cognition is where we start to, we have enough comprehension or cognition of the way the world is, that we can begin to imagine, not empathy necessarily, but we can begin to imagine how somebody else might be feeling. And then mirror neurons are a really important concept. Mirror neurons are a relatively new awareness, but these are neurons in your brain that are active when you're watching somebody else. We didn't learn about mirror neurons when I was in undergraduate school, but the idea is that when I'm watching you, that's what's active in my brain. So this would be a root of empathy, because, you know, if you've ever watched somebody get hurt and you go, oh, like you can feel it yourself, that might be your mirror neurons. Some other things that are going on here in terms of emotional development. And these terms refer to how babies are, toddlers, infants, I'm sorry, are interacting with others, and how they're learning they're learning about their emotional selves and the relationship with others. So the research tells us, I think this is actually a quiz question, and the quiz question is something like, a baby as early as 6 months old, a baby begins to respond to the facial expressions of somebody else. And that is true. There's this classic experiment down here in the still face experiment. I'm telling you, it'll break your heart. But what you watch is, you watch a 6-month-old and they're interacting with their parent. And this is what's called serve and return. So the parent is making facial expressions and the baby is making facial expressions, and they're going back and forth, right? And this is mutual regulation, reciprocal socialization, or the baby is learning to respond and learning about their emotional selves through interacting with their parent. Well, then the still face experiment, the parent stops and they just quit. They just become still faced. And you watch the child in a very short order, like, have this emotional breakdown, right? So the kid squeals, he reaches out to his mom, and the mom is just still faced. And gradually the child gets more and more upset. And the researchers, you know, say that this is evidence that we want to interact with people, or babies want to interact with their caregiver, that they need this interaction with their caregiver, because this is how they learn to regulate, right? The ability of an infant and a caregiver to respond to each other's cues. We learn about emotional expression by interacting with people. Reciprocal, what's that one say? Infant behavior invites, oh yeah, reciprocal socialization. That's what you see with this baby. The baby squeals and screeches because they're trying to get their mom to interact with them, and the mom doesn't do as they expect their mother to respond, right? And then finally, what's it say? Social referencing, seeking information from others. So social referencing is, you know, why it's so important for the parents when during scary times not to be scared, right? Or not to express, because their children are looking to them as they're going to respond to the emotional expressions of their parent. That's what social referencing. If the mother is petrified of the thunder, then the child will learn to be petrified of the thunder too. And that speaks to this theory of social learning theory, social learning theory. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and in the next lecture we'll talk about temperament, which is part of personality, which affects how we emotionally respond.